It's 75 years since the end of the Second World War. In May and August, we had muted commemorations for VE and VJ days, marking the end of the war in Europe and against Japan in 1945. The reason for our low-key approach was, of course, the impact of COVID-19. Likewise, this year's Remembrance events will take place without the usual spectacle. This Sunday, Remembrance Sunday, the ceremony at the Cenotaph in London will not see the usual parades of thousands of veterans, cheering crowds, and the same reduced scale events will be mirrored across the UK, including our own in Dungannon Town Square. Today, we are facing the challenge of sustaining our nation's economy and the health of our communities in the face of an ongoing global pandemic. In 1945, governments across the world faced even greater challenges. Infrastructure, industries, and transport links all had to be rebuilt. Accommodation found for millions left homeless, and communities, towns, and cities pieced back together. As the world awoke from the horrors of the Second World War, nations and communities began to rebuild. Governments worked to bring a sense of regeneration, hope, and normality to their societies, while those in the armed forces began to make the long journey home. 3.8 million British men and 400,000 women were demobilised, returning to their homes and families, some for the first time in many years. Many of the feelings, emotions, and challenges faced by the Second World War generation, while different in their causes and extent, will resonate with many people today. Shortages of goods, feeling socially isolated, familial dislocation and separation, a sense of the unknown, a feeling of being forgotten. And of course, the positive feeling of collaboration across nations and communities to face a common foe. And as the entire nation relied on our service personnel and public servants then, so we do again today. Those feelings of isolation and dislocation were felt not only by service personnel returning to families and homes they hadn't seen for many years, but also by prisoners of war released from camps in Europe or the Far East. For many prisoners, their long journey was not only measured in miles and days travelling, but also in terms of the challenge of making a physical and mental recovery after years of incarceration and even torture. For some who were to remain in the armed forces, they would also see further service in new conflicts in Palestine, Indonesia, and elsewhere. There was a long process of demobilisation for Commonwealth forces too. Commonwealth forces from Africa weren't fully repatriated from service in India and Burma until November 1946, more than a year after the war had ended. And pre-partition Indian forces, which at their height had reached 2.5 million, took until the 1st of July 1947 to demobilise close to 1.8 million men and women. Thousands of veterans returned home with injuries, both physical and psychological. For many, these would take years to recover from, as they tried to find their place back into old communities, or in the case of some Commonwealth forces, into entire new nations, such as the newly independent India. It is estimated 300,000 British veterans were described as having a physical or psychological disability on their return, 17,000 of whom were women. Over the course of the war, approximately 3 million people, mainly children, had been evacuated from British cities to the safety of rural towns and villages, or even to Commonwealth states like Australia. RSD received many boys from Belfast Inst, for example. 150 Inst boys were lodged with families of RSD pupils, and 100 other boys were lodged in Northland Row at a large hostel opposite the school. They became pupils of RSD for the duration. Of those who were evacuated, the hostel boys stayed longest and were taught partly by INT staff and partly by RSD staff. By September 1945, there remained nearly 20,000 evacuees in the UK still to return to their homes and families. More widely, there were approximately 40 million refugees in Europe at the end of the war, and an estimated 60 million worldwide. For many, their lives and homes had been completely overtaken by war, and they would have to build new lives from scratch. The consequences of the Second World War would be felt across nations, societies, and communities all across the world. None more so than the massive social changes it unleashed. The most destructive war in history, the Second World War was a massive driver of not only social, but also technological, political, and economic change. While today we see the massive societal changes brought about by COVID-19, for example, in how we work, communicate, travel, and feed ourselves, the Second World War would have an effect on every aspect of life. New families were created as women married servicemen of other nations and moved overseas. Children were born in fatherless homes as a result of demobilised troops leaving the UK to return to the US or Canada, or due to a death as a result of the war. And the divorce rate spiked as many families struggled to readjust to a world at peace. Many were looking for new nations. Commonwealth troops emigrated to Britain. Jewish survivors of the Holocaust looked east and west for a new home. Polish soldiers made Britain their permanent home. And new social policies were to change nations across the world. In the UK and other Commonwealth nations, post-war elections paved the way for incoming governments that radically altered social policies. No part of the UK had been left untouched by the war. More than 2 million homes were badly damaged or destroyed in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. At the end of the war, it was estimated 750,000 new homes were needed, and over the next decade, 1 million new homes were built, many in new towns. A welfare state was introduced, with government guaranteeing healthcare and education for every citizen. The most famous of reforms was the creation of the National Health Service, which began its work in July 1948. The sense of importance of the NHS felt during the current COVID-19 crisis is exactly in keeping with the sentiments of the post-war era, that every British citizen should enjoy the best healthcare, free at the point of delivery. The Second World War generation would have understood our pride and gratitude towards our frontline healthcare workers this year. The challenges of leaving, missing, and returning home are still faced by service families today. And just like in 1945, today the Royal British Legion remains a place to find help, companionship, and shared memories. The Legion's Poppy campaign raises funds each year to ensure that service personnel and their families have the additional support they need when confronted with the challenges of poor health, injury, or loss. Buying a poppy, like many of us have done from our charities committee this week, is both a practical help and an acknowledgement of their amazing work. For the 209 RSD former pupils who served during the Second World War, and those who served thereafter, some of whom of course needed such help, our collective support is greatly appreciated. This Remembrance Sunday, or next Wednesday on Remembrance Day itself, we can have them in our thoughts. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.